Number 21. Dick was a clever boy, but his parents were poor, so he had to work in his spare time and during his holidays to pay for his education. In spite of this, he managed to get to the university, but it was so expensive to study there that during the holidays he found it necessary to get 2 jobs at the same time, so as to earn enough money to pay for his studies. One summer he managed to get a job in a butcher's shop during the daytime, and another in a hospital at night. In the shop he learnt to cut meat up quite nicely, so the butcher often left him to do all the serving while he went into a room behind the shop to do the accounts. In the hospital, on the other hand, he was, of course, allowed to do only the simplest jobs, like helping to lift people and to carry them from one part of the hospital to another. Both at the butcher's shop and at the hospital, Dick had to wear white clothes. One evening at the hospital, Dick had to help to carry a woman from her bed to the place where she was to have an operation. The woman was already feeling frightened at the thought of the operation before he came to get her. But when she saw Dick, that finished her. "No, no," she cried, "not my butcher! I won't be operated on by my butcher," and fainted away.
Number 22. Nasruddin was a poor man, so he tried to grow as many vegetables as he could in his own garden, so that he would not have to buy so many in the market. One evening he heard a noise in his garden and looked out of the window. A white ox had got into the garden and was eating his vegetables. Nasruddin at once took his stick, ran out and chased the ox, but he was too old to catch it. When he got back to his garden, he found that the ox had ruined most of his precious vegetables. The next morning, while he was walking in the street near his house, he saw a cart with 2 white oxen, which looked very much like the one that had eaten his vegetables. He was carrying his stick with him, so he at once began to beat the 2 oxen with it. As neither of them looked more like the ox that had eaten his vegetables than the other, he beat both of them equally hard. The owner of the ox cart was drinking coffee in a coffee house. When he saw what Nasruddin was doing to his animals, he ran out and shouted, "What are you doing? What have those poor animals done to you for you to beat them like that?" "You keep out of this," Nasruddin shouted back. "This is a matter between me and one of these 2 oxen. He knows very well why I'm beating him."
Number 23. The war had begun, and George had joined the Air Force. He wanted to be a pilot, and after some months he managed to get to the Air Force training school, where they taught pilots to fly. There, the first thing that new students had to do was to be taken up in a plane by an experienced pilot to give them some idea of what it felt like. Even those who'd travelled as passengers in commercial airline planes before found it strange to be in the cockpit of a small fighter plane, and most of the new students felt nervous. The officer, who had to take the students up for their first flight, allowed them to fly the plane for a few seconds, if they wanted to, and if they were not too frightened to try. But he was always ready to take over as soon as the plane started to do dangerous things. George was one of those who took over the controls of the plane when he went up in it for the first time. And after the officer had taken them from him again, George thought that he'd better ask a few questions to show how interested he was and how much he wanted to learn to fly. There were a number of instruments in front of him, so he chose one and asked the officer what it was. The officer looked at him strangely for a moment and then answered, "That is the clock."
Number 24. Mr. Robinson had to travel somewhere on business, and as he was in a hurry, he decided to go by air. He liked sitting beside a window when he was flying, so when he got onto the plane, he looked for a window seat. He found that all of them had already been taken, except for one. There was a soldier sitting in the seat beside this one, and Mr. Robinson was surprised that he hadn't taken the one by the window. But anyhow, he at once went towards it. When he reached it, however, he saw that there was a notice on it. It was written in ink and said, "This seat is reserved for proper load balance. Thank you." Mr. Robinson had never seen such a notice in a plane before, but he thought that the plane must be carrying something particularly heavy in its baggage room, which made it necessary to have the passengers properly balanced. So he walked on and found another empty seat, not beside a window, to sit in. 2 or 3 other people tried to sit in the window seat beside the soldier, but they too read the notice and went on. Then, when the plane was nearly full, a very beautiful girl stepped into the plane. The soldier, who was watching the passengers coming in, quickly took the notice off the seat beside him, and in this way succeeded in having the company of the girl during the whole of the trip.
Number 25. Mrs. Jones was very fond of singing. She had a good voice, except that some of her high notes tended to sound like a gate which someone had forgotten to oil. Mrs. Jones was very conscious of this weakness, and took every opportunity she could find to practice these high notes. As she lived in a small house, where she could not practice without disturbing the rest of the family, she usually went for long walks along the country roads whenever she had time, and practiced her high notes there. Whenever she heard a car or a person coming along the road, she stopped and waited until she could no longer be heard before she started practicing again, because she was a shy person, and because she was sensitive about those high notes. One afternoon, however, a fast, open car came up behind her so silently and so fast that she did not hear it until it was only a few yards from her. She was singing some of her highest and most difficult notes at the time, and as the car passed her, she saw an anxious expression suddenly come over its driver's face. He put his brakes on violently, and as soon as the car stopped, jumped out and began to examine all his tires carefully. Mrs. Jones did not dare to tell him what the noise he had heard had really been, so he got back into his car and drove off as puzzled as he had been when he stopped.
Number 26. April the 1st is a day on which, in some countries, people try to play tricks on others. If one succeeds in tricking somebody, one laughs and says, "April Fool." And then the person who has been tricked usually laughs too. One April the 1st, a country bus was going along a winding road when it slowed down and stopped. The driver anxiously turned switches and pressed buttons, but nothing happened. Then he turned to the passengers with a worried look on his face and said, "This poor bus is getting old. It isn't going as well as it used to. There's only one thing to do if we want to get home today. I shall count 3, and on the word 3, I want you all to lean forward suddenly as hard as you can. That should get the bus started again. But if it doesn't, I'm afraid there is nothing else I can do. Now, all of you, lean back as far as you can in your seats and get ready." The passengers all obediently pressed back against their seats and waited anxiously. Then the driver turned to his front and asked, "Are you ready?" The passengers hardly had enough breath to answer yes. 1, 2, 3, counted the driver. The passengers all swung forward suddenly, and the bus started up at a great rate. The passengers breathed more easily and began to smile with relief. But their smiles turned to surprised and then delighted laughter when the driver merrily cried, "April Fool!"
Number 27. The Women's College had a very small car park, and as several of the teachers and students, and many of the students' boyfriends, had cars, it was often difficult to find a place to park. The head of the college, whose name was Miss Baker, therefore had a special place in the car park for her own small car. There were white lines round it, and it had a notice saying, "Reserved for head of college." One evening, however, when Miss Baker got back to the college a few minutes before the time by which all students had to be in, she found another car in her parking space. There were 2 people in it, one of her girl students and a young man. Miss Baker knew that the young man would have to leave very soon, so she decided to ask him to move his car a bit so that she could park hers in the proper place for the night before going to bed. As the young man's car was close to the railings, Miss Baker had to drive up beside it on the other side, where the girl was sitting. She therefore came up on this side, opened her own window, and tapped her horn lightly to draw attention to the fact that she was there. The girl, who had her head on the boy's shoulder, looked around in surprise. She was even more surprised when she heard Miss Baker say, "Excuse me, but may I change places with you?"
Number 28. The soldiers had just arrived in France. None of them could speak any French except Harry, who boasted that he knew the language very well. The other soldiers didn't really believe him, because they knew that he was always boasting about something, and that what he said about himself was seldom true. For some days the soldiers were all kept in camp, so they had no need or opportunity to speak any French. But then the day came when they were allowed to leave for the weekend. "Now we can see whether you really speak French or not," they said to Harry. "All right," Harry answered. "Come with me and I'll show you." About 10 minutes after they had left the camp, they saw a pretty girl of about 20 on the other side of the road. They would all have liked to speak to her, but of course none of them knew any French except, perhaps, Harry. "Now's your chance to show us whether you can really speak French, Harry," said one of his friends. "Go and speak to that girl." "All right," Harry answered, and he crossed the road, smiled, bowed politely to the girl, and started to speak to her. He had said only a few sentences when the girl's face turned red, and she smacked his face angrily and walked off. Harry crossed the road to his friends again, his face all smiles, and said, "There you are. I told you I could speak French, didn't I?"
Number 29. When sailors are allowed ashore after a long time at sea, they sometimes get drunk and cause trouble. For this reason, the Navy always has naval police in big ports. When sailors cause trouble, the naval police come and deal with them. One day, the naval police in one big seaport received an urgent telephone call from a bar in the town. The barman said that a big sailor had got drunk and was breaking the furniture in the bar. The petty officer who was in charge of the naval police guard that evening said that he would come immediately. Now, petty officers who had to go and deal with sailors who were violently drunk usually chose the biggest naval policeman they could find to go with them. But this particular petty officer did not do this. Instead, he chose the smallest and weakest-looking man he could find to go to the bar with him and arrest the sailor who was breaking the furniture. Another petty officer, who happened to be there, was surprised when he saw the petty officer of the guard choose this small man. So he said to him, "Why don't you take a big man with you? You may have to fight the sailor who is drunk." "Yes, you are quite right," answered the petty officer of the guard. "That's exactly why I'm taking this small man. If you saw two policemen coming to arrest you, and one of them was much smaller than the other, which one would you attack?"
Number 30. The manager of a small building company was very surprised to get a bill for 2 white mice, which one of his workmen had bought. He sent for the workman and asked him why he'd had the bill sent to the company. "Well," the workman answered, "you remember the house we were repairing in Newbridge last week, don't you? One of the things we had to do there was to put in some new electric wiring. Well, in one place we had to pass some wires through a pipe 30 feet long and about an inch across, which was built into solid stone and had 4 big bends in it. None of us could think how to do this until I had a good idea. I went to a shop and bought 2 white mice, one of them male and the other female. Then I tied a thread to the body of the male mouse and put him into the pipe at one end, while Bill held the female mouse at the other end and pressed her gently to make her squeak. When the male mouse heard the female mouse's squeaks, he rushed along the pipe to help her. I suppose he was a gentleman, even though he was only a mouse. Anyway, as he ran through the pipe, he pulled a thread behind him. It was then quite easy for us to tie one end of the thread to the electric wires and pull them through the pipe. The manager paid the bill for the white mice.